to interject, that's a very clear case where that's the people who invented that. Like a lot of inventions aren't like that, right? You can sort of say a bunch of people contributed, but that's it started with Wolfenstein. I may guess that maybe Ultima or something. There were glimpses of it before that, but it was Wolfenstein that really did it.
So I received an email from Nintendo, like the company, Nintendo. And I'm going through my email. At first, I think, it's a marketing message. And then I notice that it says Bubba's account.
Our 7-year-old son's
7-year-old
username.
Bubba has been temporarily suspended from the service for harassment and bullying.
So I shit my pants.
I didn't. I did not jump to conclusions, but you were like, what is he doing?
Yeah, I was like pissed off. And so we called him upstairs. And I was like, what's going on? Like, all pissed off.
And he's like, I don't remember.
And I said, no.
No, you remember. You haven't been able to use the online service since this event and won't for somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 more hours.
And he said, well, they were mean to me first. And I said, okay, so what did you say to them? And he said, I said, shut up. And I was like, that is not a reason for you to get suspended. What else happened? And Peter said, well, no, I understand why they could suspend for something like that because of how Bubba interacts with the Among Us chat. Like, he'll go in and say, like, poopus.
Yeah, he'll say poopus, like, a lot of times.
And Peter explains it, and that can get you banned. And then Bubba goes, I did also say poopus. Like, just like that. And I said, okay. And he's like, they said the F word to me also. And I said, did you say it back? He's like, no, I just said shut up. But I did say poopus.
So he was very likely annoying the hell out of those people when they mass reported him.
Spamming the chat. Bubba is a chip off the old block.
Oh, yeah. I also spam the chat in Among Us.
Of trolling. It's unbelievable.
I really like to autocomplete a bunch of words into the Among Us chat.
I did say poopus.
Okay, so imagine this as a trial in a courtroom.
Well, yeah, because that's what I was about to get ready to do. I was going to put my son's ass over the fire because I want to raise upstanding members of society.
Yeah.
Who don't bully.
So you're the prosecution. And I am the defense.
No, we're on the same team.
And this is not real. We're imagining something. Imagine a second lawyer of no particular affiliation in this courtroom who just happens to be there. So Columbo stands up in the audience. So Columbo gets up and he goes, did you say poopus? Yes, I said poopus. I did say poopus.
I just still can't wrap my head around him being the one identified as a harasser for saying poopus.
Oh, that tweet where I put Hitler above Sophie's eyebrows, that is now labeled as a possible harassment tweet.
Yeah, but like that contains a genocidal figure in it. He just said poopus. Write in the comments if you think Bubba actually harassed someone.
Tighten your buttholes. It's time for Pact. I'm the P, Peter Coffin, the lovely Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor right here is the ACD. Together, we are Pact. Don't miss an episode. Like, comment, subscribe. Leave us a glowing review on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever weird thing you use. We are a 5-star podcast.
Not 3, not 4, 5! I'm a 5-star man!
Join our Discord. We hang out there all the time. We chat. We do some other fun stuff, and you can access it by becoming a patron. Movie night, reading group, exclusive content that you can see either before everybody else or instead of everybody else. Like they can't see it. You can see it when you're a patron. So help us keep the lights on by becoming a patron at patreon.com/pactpod. That is PACDPOD. Also, we've got great Pact merch available too. I'm wearing the best shirt out of the whole bunch, the best selling shirt currently. The ACD in a comfy, looking very tough.
Very tough.
With the word king with an X instead of the I in it. Very tough.
Very tough.
Got that Italian mobster look to you. That's what mobsters dress like. It's a stereotype. They all go out in comfies now. Tough stuff. You're going to like go rough a guy up. We stream 7 p.m. Eastern every Sunday. Thanks so much for tuning in.
It really feels like the idea of cultural appropriation is straining to find worthy enemies. It feels like at this point it's devouring itself. Cultural appropriation is not a bad idea. It's an idea that has done what it needed to do, and it is now time for it to leave. It is time to bid farewell to cultural appropriation.
Today, we're going to speak with a gentleman by the name of Kirby Ferguson. Kirby is best known for a documentary series he wrote and directed called Everything is a Remix, which I think the title probably contextualizes today's topic well. Kirby and his series can be found at youtube.com/Kirby Ferguson, and he can be found on Twitter at Remix Everything. Kirby, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure, guys.
To get started, obviously, a lot of people have heard of or about cultural appropriation, but for those who haven't, can you give a quick version of what you would consider to be a widely accepted definition of it?
It's something to the effect of it's copying from another culture in an unacknowledged or inappropriate way without their permission. And generally, it's assumed that it's a higher ranking group copying from a lower ranking group.
Yeah,
I'd say that is the consensus opinion. But in this world, I have found people like to argue about what things mean. But it seems like that is the most broadly held definition.
So with that said, and you even kind of acknowledge this in your video as well, like you're going to be the guy that talks about this, or even in your words, the white guy that talks about this.
Yes.
So what kind of got you going to do that? Like what was the motivation for the video that specifically made you decide, I'm going to make this in this way?
I think it was a couple things. It was like, number one, people were using my series, Everything is Remix, as an argument against cultural appropriation, but I never said anything about cultural appropriation in the video. So I felt kind of like I'd rather say something about this rather than people using this sort of meta argument about appropriation. I'd like to actually address it my way and specifically talk about it. So it partially was that. And partially was just keeping tabs on the conversation and just seeing the low level that it has remained at. And I think part of the reason that it's remained at a low level is because people are afraid to say anything against this idea. So I was like, I'm going to say something. I mean, the way I looked at it was can I contribute something positive, something that is worthwhile, something that moves the conversation along? I thought I could, and that was sort of the tipping point for me. Beyond just people are using my other thing to talk about this thing that's not really that thing. There also was I don't feel like there's obvious points that could be made that are not being made, and I guess I'll be the guy. So it was a bit unwillingly that I did it. Quite frankly, it was an eventual just okay, I guess I'm gonna do this. I don't really want to do this, but I guess I'll do it.
We know how that is.
Yeah. We're
Yes.
There's a lot of that going on here.
Yes.
So in the video, you say cultural appropriation is kind of struggling to find more enemies. And most definitions I've seen mention power, but don't really account for it. They note a dominant culture or identity taking from a smaller one, but
or less powerful,
or a less powerful one. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's kind of an obvious difference between a high schooler wearing a dress and a media corporation appropriating a cultural something of cultural significance to make money. Why do you think that people are more likely to get angry about the Chinese prom dress over like a large company? Because it seems like that's generally where the hatred is directed, at an individual who does something.
Who doesn't have power.
Yeah, generally who doesn't have power, yeah.
I mean, maybe it's because they are particular people. We have a thing about, rather than entities, we like to deal with people. I think that might be part of it. It's just like, here's a person, rather than it's Pepsi or whatever, and who the hell is Pepsi, you know? Like, where they use, like, it was clearly like Black Lives Matter type imagery that they were using in this stupid ad about Pepsi. But they targeted, what's her name, Kardashian. Film. Do one of you know which Kardashian it was?
Yeah,
I think it was Kylie Jenner.
It was Kylie Jenner.
Kylie Jenner. It wasn't even.
Which is, I mean, technically the same family. So.
Yes. So it was Kylie Jenner, and it was her that took the brunt of it. But like, it's not her ad campaign. She didn't write it. She didn't direct it. She didn't conceive it. So it's really Pepsi. And then the same thing happened with Addison Rae, where she went on the Tonight Show and did a bunch of mostly Black kids dances, and they weren't given any credit. And it was her that took the brunt of that, but really it's the Tonight Show that had her do
Yeah,
this.
exactly.
She just showed up and danced, I'm sure. So we definitely have a thing where we like to target people rather than sort of impersonal entities. I think that might be part of it. And part of it might just be it's a weaker target. I'm going to be a lot more outspoken. And maybe you feel like maybe people just feel like they can change that person, whereas you can't change some big corporation or powerful entity or whatever. Maybe that's part of it. But my top guess, and it's a guess, would be that it's because we like to interact with people rather than impersonal organizations.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a good point. There's this impetus to put a face to the problem. And so much of what...
That's where scapegoating comes from, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's scapegoating.
Which is what Awkwafina is, I think. She's a scapegoat.
I agree.
The perfect example of that in your video. And a lot of what Peter and I do is directing people away from individuals. And even if they're celebrities who like ostensibly have more power than the average person, directing people away from individuals and towards systems. And I think it's really interesting that thank you, that your analysis of cultural appropriation, I never thought about it this way, but it goes into that exact like consumer activism framework that
it does,
that we've talked about.
Yeah. A big portion of what we do is about like what you consume as like a choice in a consumer market. People think that the world is just going to supply what they demand, so to speak. And if you consume the right way, the assumption is that the world is just going to give you the right world in response. Do you think this is sort of a version of consuming? Do you think it's a sort of way of this person's wrong maybe being a product, and you sort of putting a demand out into the world, asking it to supply something different?
I don't know. Honestly, I've not thought of it within that paradigm. I have no doubt that it is. Like, we just live in the mentality of consumerism is so pervasive. Maybe that's it's just so I so assume that that's the way it works that I haven't specifically thought about it.
That is completely fair.
But I would say I'm sure that is absolutely a part of it. I mean, just the capitalist mindset is just baked into all of us. I think something that has happened is that the conversation has been co-opted by people who often are influential themselves, who have power, who are speaking on behalf of people who don't have power. I think that's certainly part of it. Like, the people who are frequently the most vocal about it, they actually are doing just great. They really don't have much to complain about. And they're sort of taking from people who are lower than them in the socioeconomic scale, totem pole. They're sort of taking this issue from them, whereas they themselves probably don't really have that much to talk about. There's also a lot of like taking from people will just how do I phrase this one? They'll take from cultures that aren't necessarily their own. Like they'll broadly think it's theirs. Like an Asian person will take something that is Korean and claim it as theirs. And to me, it's like, I don't know, like, is that it's an Asian issue, but it seems like it's specifically about Korea. Like, is it really your thing to talk about? I don't know. Maybe Asian people would say that it is. I don't know that I want to die on that hill. But it seems like some of these things are from specific regions, and it seems like people of a certain broad ethnicity are claiming them as their own.
Mm-hmm. So one of my ongoing projects is a book I'm working on called Woke Ouroboros. It's a criticism of what people are calling woke ideology that kind of argues that it devolves into a bit of a war of all against all, as you put it in the video. Mm-hmm. Rather than targeting power in any way, which would be how these things are being propagated. One of the biggest concerns I have, you cover as well in the takeaway section of your video, which is when you say the message you fear people get from these incidents is just stick to your own. It's the safest. Would you expand on the sort of segregationist element of this as you observe it?
Yeah, I think that I have in the video, I think it's clear in the video that I have sympathy for people who make the cultural appropriation argument. I have no doubt. Yeah, it happens. There's lots of examples in the video where I'm like, yeah, like I think this is right.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are going to argue for blackface anytime soon.
Yes, and there's simpler ones like the sports controversies with baseball teams, like with the Cleveland Indians and stuff like that, where I'm like, yeah, like just don't do that. Like, do I think it's a crucial issue? No, but like just call your team the Bears or whatever.
Yeah, no, agreed.
Pick an animal and go with it. You don't need to use a whole ethnicity as your name. Yeah. Anyway, so I certainly there's plenty of stuff that I agree with, and but I find a thing that a lot of people who are into the idea of cultural appropriation and really see it in the world, they want a very specific version of the definition. I feel like this is something that happens to me a lot. People tell me, no, it doesn't mean this, it means this other thing. People of a progressive type bent, which I'm sort of that world, argue about what things mean a lot. They're really excessively into language. So they want there to be this very specific, very detailed message. But I think the way that culture works, the way that pop culture works, is there's a very kind of broad version of the argument is what circulates, and it's the message that people get. So I feel like some people, they actually don't disagree with my video very much because they have this very particular definition of cultural appropriation that is pretty compatible with what I'm saying in the video. But I think it's a very dumbed down version of that idea that circulates in the culture. And I think the message that most people will get is just that, oh, like it's kind of risky. Like if you want to use a black phrase or whatever, like, yeah, people might call you racist about that. Like, don't do it. It's just this simple version of the story is what circulates. And the simplest thing to do is just, okay, I'm not going to touch this stuff that's not white or is not whatever my culture is or whatever. And keep in mind, these groups can get smaller and smaller and smaller. Like white is a great big group, but it can be men or it can be gay men or it can be whatever. It can, these groups can get tinier and tinier. So it's that degraded version of the story is what circulates. And I think the message that people get from that is just stick to stuff that is your tribe's.
Well, yeah. I mean, the concept that we think about that's kind of related to this, it's not cultural appropriation. But if you remember in 2020, when Black Lives Matter protests really exploded and became really highly publicized, of course, it's been going on for the past decade, but a lot of media coverage on this. There's that video of a white woman directing white people out of the protest, saying, this is not your hood, and segregating Black and white people who are engaging in a protest for racial justice. Mm-hmm. And it kind of reminds me of that a little bit.
And then you have an activist who comes in and says, no, stop this.
Yeah, like that makes this less effective and is the opposite of what we're advocating for. Mm-hmm.
a point that I make in the video is that people copying your stuff can be good, right? Like, I personally believe that it is good for Black culture to be getting copied, and we're talking like ripped off, like just flagrantly, people just ripping your stuff off. That can be a good thing as well. It's sort of like if your movie is getting pirated, that means people are interested in your movie. They want to see your movie. So it's not good that it's getting pirated. I don't think it's good if people are ripping off your culture, but it's a sign that like there is interest in what you're doing. People are engaging with it and people love it, you know? So I feel like this copying, this taking from other people's culture, even in an inappropriate way, is a good sign that your culture is robust and growing and healthy. And it's financially good for it's good for Black artists if people are copying Black music. I think that's a benefit to them. So I feel like people, this sort of segregationist mindset of like, don't touch our stuff, I think it's going to give you the opposite of what you really want. Like, I think it's going to make people less likely to connect with your stuff because they're scared of it.
They're less likely to connect with it, and you're less likely to profit off of ideas that originate in your own culture.
For sure. Absolutely.
You use the Elvis example. I think that's great.
To give what I think is an example that actually takes race completely out of it, if you go back to the 1990s, or actually a little bit further, id Software made the Wolfenstein and the Doom games.
Yeah.
And for a while, whenever anybody else made a game like that, it was called a Doom clone.
Right.
And it wasn't as though like people were actually just flat out ripping off Doom. They saw that this game was created from a first person perspective, and you had a gun and you went around and shot things. Yeah. And as other people made that, it was called a Doom clone. And then after a while, it started being called a first person shooter. And if id Software had been litigious about this, and they probably could have been, to be frank, there wasn't really any precedent at the time, so they could have been.
That's a very clear case, to interject. That's a very clear case where like that's the people who invented that. Like a lot of inventions aren't like that, right? You can sort of say a bunch of people contributed, but that's like, it started with Wolfenstein. I may guess that maybe Ultima or something, there were glimpses of it before that, but like it was Wolfenstein that really did it.
It made those dynamics.
Yeah.
The gun, the first person, it was Wolfenstein. And I can't help but think like if it had gone in the way that like the cultural appropriation argument has gone, there wouldn't be first person shooters, or at least not to the level that there are at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'll expand. I'll pick up on the Elvis bit that you mentioned, but like, I think that like in the 1950s, what Elvis did that was good, and I'm not just saying like everything worked out fantastic with Elvis. Like if the country was further along in its racial development at that point, things could have been better. But it was the 1950s. It was the era of Jim Crow. It was the era of segregation in the South. So there was still developing that had to be done. And I'm not saying that the culture was racially healthy at the time. It was not. But the thing that Elvis did is the reason he gets called the king of rock and roll is because he is the guy that made rock and roll the new thing. It really is about him. He was this huge, gigantic media personality. And if there wasn't him, it wasn't going to be Jerry Lee Lewis or Bill Haley or Buddy Holly or whatever. Like those weren't rock stars in the same way, right? Like Elvis was a rock star. He was it had to be, only certain people can explode like that. And he was one of them through a combination of his talent and his humor. He was a lighthearted, funny person. And he was like super good looking. That was part of it, right? He was a seriously good looking guy. But the thing that he did,
we can all agree on this.
We can all agree.
He made that era, popularized the Black music of that era. Without him, it's possible that people like Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Fats Domino, Bo Diddley, they would have been more like the generation before them, where there wasn't this crossover figure. And there's a bunch of names from back then that people don't remember because those people didn't have someone who popularized the music and brought it to a mainstream audience. So the thing that Elvis did was he made that form of music the big thing, right? That was what he did. And I'm not sure. I think it's too bad that a Black artist couldn't have done that at that particular time. But it was good for Black music in that period of the early 50s. It was a help to them right then, and it helped those artists make a lot of money. A lot of those artists ultimately were worth millions of dollars. And now the music industry, it seems to me, is a pretty equal place where there's a lot of successful Black artists. And it seems like that is a world where, the dream has been realized and things have gone really well racially.
Yeah, absolutely. And you referred to Elvis as an integrationist that way. And then also Michael Jackson as
it doesn't have to be somebody from the dominant culture doing it. Like Michael Jackson, in my opinion, did the same thing in that he crossed over Black music to the mainstream as well, but he himself was a Black person, but he was doing it by using white culture, by using musical theater and rock and roll and horror movies and all this sort of just mainstream Americana, which he was super into. He was just into American culture, like he was a creature of Black music. He became from the world of R&B, but he loved just American culture. That was his thing. And he did the same thing as a member of that community. It doesn't have to be a member from another community that does that for you. So he crossed over to white audiences using white culture. It doesn't have to be a white person that does it.
Well, with that said, just going back to your video, in your guide on how to not appropriate, we think that you give some helpful guidelines. You always credit, always be extra careful, especially if you're trying to profit, either financially or attention-wise, particularly for corporations. And if you love it, it's not appropriation. So all of that is very helpful. How familiar are you, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but with the concept of recuperation?
No, at all. What is it?
Sure. So it's a situationist concept, and I'll read the summary that we generally refer to. Recuperation is the process by which politically radical ideas and images are twisted, co-opted, absorbed, diffused, incorporated, annexed, or commodified within media culture and bourgeois society, and thus become interpreted through a neutralized, innocuous, or more socially conventional perspective, like Martin Luther King Jr., for example.
Yes.
More broadly.
Like everything, like every small culture. Yeah, exactly. Like punk rock, like jazz, like hip hop, like...
Punk rock's actually a popular example. It's widely used in a lot of literature talking about this.
Yeah.
So another way that it can be defined more broadly is as cultural appropriation of subversive symbols, aesthetics, or ideas by mainstream culture. So I'm wondering, or we're wondering, if you would consider recuperation through that lens as a possible component of what constitutes the problem when we're talking about this issue.
I mean, is it a problem, or is it just what happens to new ideas? Like, is it the fate of new ideas that they become banal? Like I tend to think it's that they disseminate further and further, get more and more uninteresting along the way, get exploited and used up, and then people want the new thing. I'm not sure that it's even a problem. Like, I feel like new ideas get old, and that's just the way it goes. And part of the process of getting old is that they're getting picked up by everybody and their dog, and they're talking about them and making them really boring. It's the nature of trends. It's the nature of fads. It's to me, it just seems like, I don't know, part of society, just an elemental part of society.
Well, finally, I just wanted to give a little bit of praise for this video. Not only do you do some detailed criticism that acknowledges your position relative to the issue with a pretty fair amount of nuance, I think, but you provide history, and that's just something that a lot of people like play at doing, but you actually did and connected it, and that's just something that we appreciate a lot.
Thank you.
I haven't watched your series Everything is a Remix yet, but I'm definitely gonna. And I want to recommend.
Funny because most people start with that and then end up in this other
stuff. Well, this video was actually sent to me because of the fact that we're saying a lot of these things fairly often. Somebody actually sent it to me and said, this is so similar to what you're saying. You need to watch this video. And I watched it and I'm like, this is very similar to what we're saying. It's coming from a different perspective, but that's kind of the what makes this type of a thing interesting to me is when somebody else is coming from a different place on it. Yeah. And you've definitely hooked me. I'm definitely going to be watching your series. Right. And I really want to recommend to our viewers and listeners that they do the same.
I'll watch it.
I'll tell you what, too, something else that we're simpatico on, guys, is when you talked about directing people away from individuals to systems. That's something I say. And I have a series called This Is Not a Conspiracy Theory, where that was my attempt to explore that. It was a commercial series. It's going to be released for free shortly. But it's about conspiracy theories, and the meta problem of conspiracy theories to me is that they're not interested in systems. They're not interested in abstract forces. They want to say it's whoever, it's these people, it's this guy.
That's exactly.
And that's sort of the essential problem of conspiracy theories, right?
We have people who like to call us conspiracy theorists because we're saying that.
We
Funny.
have an episode on that.
Yeah, we actually had an episode on that and said pretty much the same thing you just said.
On conspiracy theories?
Yes. It's people who get occupied with something that they observe that there is something wrong. However, they assign blame and look for a solution in the wrong places. That's basically our thing on it.
Yes.
So maybe we'll have to collaborate again.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
We're sharing the same brain somehow.
Yeah. It's always fun to find a fellow traveler, so to speak.
Yeah. That's awesome, guys. I'll have to, please do send me some of these bits that you think would be of interest.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. And also thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks for expounding on your ideas. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
And that's it for Pact. Thanks again for watching or listening. I'm Peter. This is Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. To help us out, click like, follow, subscribe, join our Discord, leave us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. To support us, become a patron at patreon.com/PactPod. That's PACDPOD. Thanks so much. Come back next week.